I thought I was just being honest. I never expected it to ruin everything. I called my boyfriend a nice backup, something I thought he'd understand as a joke, maybe even a compliment in some twisted way. But instead, he let me walk into the most humiliating moment of my life, on a crowded public bus, heading to my ex's wedding, completely alone. It was a Thursday night in late September, one of those perfect autumn evenings when the air is crisp and the world feels full of possibilities. David and I were curled up on our couch, sharing a bottle of wine and having one of those deep, rambling conversations that only happen when you're comfortable enough with someone to be completely unfiltered. That's when the subject of my ex's wedding came up, almost casually, like mentioning the weather or weekend plans. The invitation had been sitting on our kitchen counter for weeks, an elegant cream-colored card with gold lettering that announced Cameron's marriage to his new fiancée Isabella. I'd shown it to David when it first arrived, half expecting him to be jealous or uncomfortable, but he'd just nodded and said we should probably RSVP soon. As we talked about the upcoming wedding, I found myself reflecting on my relationship with Cameron and how different things were with David. Cameron had been intense, passionate, unpredictable. The kind of man who could make you feel like you were living in a romance novel one day and a psychological thriller the next. David was the opposite in every way that mattered. He was steady, reliable, thoughtful. He remembered anniversaries and brought me coffee in bed on Sunday mornings. He listened when I talked about work problems and never made me feel like my emotions were too much or too complicated. The wine had loosened my tongue and made me feel philosophical about love and relationships and the different ways people can make you happy. I was feeling grateful for David, appreciative of his stability and kindness, but also oddly nostalgic for the chaos and intensity I'd shared with Cameron. That's when I made the comment that would destroy everything. In what I thought was a moment of vulnerable honesty, I told David that he was kind of my nice backup, like the safe choice. I meant it as a compliment about his reliability, his steadiness, his role as the person I could count on after experiencing the volatility of my previous relationship. I thought I was being cute, maybe even endearingly honest, in that way that couples sometimes are when they've had enough wine to drop their usual filters. I was trying to tell him that I valued his stability, that I saw him as my safe harbor after the storm of my relationship with Cameron. But the moment the words left my mouth, I could see that I'd made a terrible mistake. David's face hardened in a way I'd never seen before. The relaxed, intimate expression disappeared, replaced by something cold and distant that made my stomach drop. He didn't say much in response, just nodded slowly and made some non-committal sound that suggested he'd heard me but wasn't interested in discussing it further. When I tried to explain what I'd meant, to clarify that I was trying to pay him a compliment about being reliable and trustworthy, he just changed the subject and suggested we watch something on Netflix. The easy, wine-warm atmosphere of the evening evaporated instantly, replaced by a tension that I couldn't seem to bridge no matter how hard I tried. I assumed he was just tired or maybe had taken my comment the wrong way, but would understand what I meant once he'd had time to think about it. I figured we'd laugh about it in the morning, that he'd realize I was trying to tell him how much I valued his consistency and dependability. I had no idea that I'd just handed him the perfect weapon to use against me. I'm Zoe, I'm 29, and I overthink nothing and underestimate everything. That combination has gotten me into more trouble than I care to admit. But this time, it cost me something I didn't know I couldn't afford to lose. David and I had been together for a year, meeting about 6 months after my brutal breakup with Cameron. I'd been emotionally exhausted from the constant drama and uncertainty of that relationship, and David had appeared in my life like a breath of fresh air. Calm, stable, uncomplicated. We'd met at a bookstore coffee shop where I was hiding out on a Saturday afternoon, trying to pretend I wasn't still devastated by Cameron's latest disappearing act. David had been at the next table, working on his laptop and occasionally glancing over with a sympathetic smile when I sighed too loudly or stared too long at my phone, waiting for messages that never came. When he finally worked up the courage to ask if I was okay, I'd ended up telling him the entire story of my relationship with Cameron over coffee that turned into lunch that turned into dinner. He'd listened without judgment, offered thoughtful observations, and made me laugh for the first time in weeks. David was everything Cameron wasn't. Where Cameron was spontaneous to the point of being unreliable, David was thoughtful and planned ahead. Where Cameron was passionate but volatile, David was steady and emotionally available. Where Cameron kept me guessing and on edge, David made me feel safe and valued. But if I'm being completely honest, there was a part of me that sometimes missed the intensity of my relationship with Cameron. The highs had been incredible, even if the lows were devastating. With David, everything was pleasant and comfortable, but it sometimes felt like we were playing it safe in ways that kept us from reaching the kinds of emotional peaks I'd experienced before. I'd never voiced these thoughts to David because I genuinely cared about him and appreciated everything he brought to my life. But maybe those feelings had been simmering under the surface, waiting for a wine-drunk moment to escape in the worst possible way. When I called him my nice backup, I was trying to articulate my gratitude for his stability after experiencing Cameron's chaos. But what David heard was that I saw him as second choice, a consolation prize, someone I'd settled for rather than chosen with enthusiasm and intentionality. I'd accidentally revealed that I still thought about Cameron as the standard against which other men were measured, and that David was the safe option I'd chosen, not because he was what I wanted most, but because he was what I needed after being hurt. The truth was more complicated than that, but my careless words had reduced our entire relationship to a simple equation. Cameron equals excitement and passion. David equals safety and backup plan. The weeks leading up to Cameron's wedding had been strange and emotionally complicated for me. Part of me was genuinely happy that he'd found someone who could give him what he needed for a stable, long-term relationship. Isabella seemed lovely, from what I'd seen on social media. Successful, beautiful, the kind of woman who could probably handle Cameron's intensity without losing herself in it. But another part of me was struggling with feelings I didn't want to acknowledge. Seeing Cameron ready to commit to someone else made me question whether the problems in our relationship had been about his inability to settle down, or about his inability to settle down with me specifically. David had been incredibly supportive throughout this whole process. When the wedding invitation arrived, he'd immediately offered to accompany me, understanding that attending your ex's wedding could be emotionally challenging even when you were happy in a new relationship. He'd suggested we make a weekend of it, maybe book a nice hotel and explore the city where the wedding was being held. He'd even offered to rent a car so we could drive instead of dealing with flight schedules, giving us more control over our timeline and logistics. I'd been touched by his thoughtfulness and consideration. This was exactly the kind of thing that made David such a wonderful partner. He anticipated potential stress points and worked to minimize them without being asked. I was actually looking forward to the wedding with David by my side. I thought it would be a chance to show him off to people from my past, to demonstrate how well I was doing and how happy I was in my new relationship. David wasn't as flashy or dramatic as Cameron, but he was solid and impressive in quieter ways. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes everything feel cinematic and important. I'd spent the previous evening getting ready, choosing the perfect dress, planning my hair and makeup, picking out a thoughtful wedding gift that struck the right balance between generous and appropriate. I'd settled on a navy blue dress that was elegant without being attention-grabbing, sophisticated enough for a formal wedding, but not so stunning that it would upstage the bride. I'd gotten my hair blown out into loose waves and kept my makeup classic and understated. David had seemed normal that morning as we went through our usual routines. He'd made coffee for both of us, commented positively on my outfit, and helped me wrap the wedding gift we'd chosen together. Everything felt exactly as it should for a couple preparing to attend a social event together. But as I was putting on my jewelry and gathering my purse, David dropped the bomb that would ruin not just my day, but potentially my entire sense of self-worth. He told me, with complete calm and apparent sincerity, that he couldn't make it to the wedding after all. He said something had come up at work, an emergency project that required his immediate attention, a crisis that couldn't wait until Monday. I stared at him in disbelief, still wearing one earring and holding the other in my hand. This was impossible. We'd been planning this for weeks. He'd helped me choose my outfit, had picked out the wedding gift, had assured me just the night before that he was looking forward to the weekend away together. When I asked him to explain what kind of work emergency could possibly arise on a Saturday morning that would require him to miss a wedding we'd RSVP'd 2 weeks ago, his explanations were vague and unsatisfying. Something about a client crisis, a deadline that had been moved up, important people who needed immediate attention. But the most shocking part was his complete lack of concern for how this would affect me. He didn't apologize profusely or seem genuinely upset about letting me down. He didn't scramble to find solutions or alternatives that would allow me to still attend the wedding with some dignity intact. Instead, he calmly suggested that I could still go without him if I wanted to. He said I was perfectly capable of attending a wedding alone, that it might even be better this way, since I could focus on reconnecting with old friends without worrying about including him in conversations. When I pointed out that the wedding was 2 hours away and we'd planned to drive together in his rental car, he just shrugged and said, I'd figure something out. Maybe I could take a train, or find a rideshare, or ask someone else who was attending to pick me up. I was stunned by his casual dismissal of the logistical nightmare he was creating for me. This wasn't just about attending a wedding alone. It was about completely reorganizing my transportation, potentially missing significant portions of the event, and walking into a social situation where I'd have to explain my boyfriend's sudden absence to people who'd been expecting to meet him. But I was too shocked and pressed for time to fully process what was happening. The wedding was starting in 3 hours, and I needed to figure out how to get there. I couldn't just not show up after RSVPing yes and picking out a gift. That's how I found myself, 45 minutes later, standing at a bus stop in my wedding attire, clutching a carefully wrapped gift and trying not to cry as I waited for public transportation that would get me to my ex-boyfriend's wedding. The bus was crowded with the usual Saturday afternoon mix of weekend workers, shoppers, and people running errands. I felt completely ridiculous in my navy dress and heels, overdressed and out of place among people in jeans and casual clothes. As I settled into a seat near the back, trying to arrange my dress so it wouldn't wrinkle, and keeping my gift bag carefully balanced on my lap, my phone buzzed with a text message from David. What I read made my blood run cold and finally helped me understand what had really happened. Nice backups don't attend weddings, they stay behind. In that moment, everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. This wasn't a work emergency. This wasn't a last-minute crisis that had derailed our weekend plans. This was calculated revenge for my nice backup comment, planned and executed with surgical precision to cause maximum humiliation and distress. David had let me get dressed up, had helped me prepare for an event he had no intention of attending, had waited until the very last possible moment to abandon me, so I'd have no time to make alternative arrangements or process what was happening. He'd turned my thoughtless comment into the justification for a level of cruelty I never would have imagined him capable of. The steady, reliable man I'd trusted with my heart had orchestrated my public humiliation with the same methodical planning he brought to everything else in his life. I sat on that bus, surrounded by strangers and struggling not to cry, realizing that I'd completely misjudged the person I'd been sharing my life with for the past year. The nice backup had turned out to be someone capable of vindictive revenge that went far beyond anything I could have deserved. The 2-hour bus ride gave me plenty of time to process what had happened and prepare myself for the humiliation that awaited me at the wedding. I knew that arriving alone, via public transportation, after RSVPing for 2 people, would create exactly the kind of gossip and speculation that David had undoubtedly intended. I tried to come up with explanations that would minimize the embarrassment. Maybe David had gotten food poisoning. Maybe there had been a family emergency. Maybe his flight had been cancelled. But I knew that whatever story I told would sound hollow and suspicious to people who'd been expecting to meet my wonderful, supportive boyfriend. When the bus finally pulled up to the stop nearest the wedding venue, I gathered my composure and stepped off into the late afternoon sunlight. My dress had wrinkled slightly during the ride, my carefully styled hair was a bit mussed, and I felt emotionally drained before the event had even begun. But the worst was yet to come. As I walked up the steps to the elegant hotel where Cameron and Isabella were getting married, I could see familiar faces from my past turning to stare. These were people who'd known me during my relationship with Cameron, who'd probably been curious about my life post-breakup and eager to meet the new man who'd won my heart. Instead, they were witnessing me arrive alone, slightly disheveled, clearly flustered, with no explanation for why my +1 had failed to materialize. Cameron himself was greeting guests near the entrance, looking handsome in his tuxedo and radiating the kind of confident happiness that comes with marrying someone you're genuinely excited about. When he saw me approaching alone, his eyebrows raised in surprise. He asked where David was, and I fumbled through some vague explanation about work emergencies and last-minute conflicts. But I could see the amusement in Cameron's eyes as he processed my obvious distress and the implications of my solo arrival. Isabella appeared at his side, beautiful in her wedding dress and gracious in the way that brides are taught to be on their special day. But when Cameron whispered something to her about my situation, I caught a flash of what might have been pity or satisfaction in her expression. The ceremony itself was beautiful and painful in equal measure. I was seated alone in a pew toward the back, surrounded by couples and families who'd all managed to coordinate their schedules and transportation successfully. Every time someone asked about David, I had to repeat my increasingly unconvincing explanation while feeling more foolish and abandoned. During the cocktail hour, I overheard snippets of conversation that made it clear my situation had become a topic of interest among the guests. People were speculating about what had happened to my boyfriend, whether we'd broken up, whether I'd been stood up or was dealing with some kind of personal crisis. One of the bridesmaids, a girl I'd never particularly liked during my relationship with Cameron, actually took a photo of me standing alone by the bar, looking miserable in my carefully chosen outfit. I saw her showing it to other members of the wedding party, all of whom glanced over at me with expressions ranging from sympathy to entertainment. The reception was even worse. I'd been seated at a table with distant relatives and +1s of other guests, clearly a last-minute rearrangement to accommodate my unexpected solo status. The conversation was awkward and stilted, with people clearly trying to avoid asking about my missing boyfriend, while obviously being curious about the situation. During dinner, I checked my phone and discovered that David had made his feelings even clearer through social media. He'd unfollowed me on Instagram, changed his relationship status to single, and posted a new profile photo, a solo shot from a recent hiking trip with a caption that read, "Settling doesn't mean staying." The message was clear to anyone who knew us. Our relationship was over, ended by his decision to punish me for calling him a backup option. He'd chosen to make that ending as public and humiliating as possible, ensuring that my ex's wedding would forever be associated with my romantic failure and social embarrassment. I made it through the ceremony and reception with as much dignity as I could muster, but the bus ride home was one of the lowest points of my adult life. I sat in the same seat I'd occupied hours earlier, still wearing my wedding attire, but now completely emotionally drained, watching the city lights blur past as I tried to process how thoroughly my life had been upended. When I finally got home around midnight, I discovered that David had been busy during my absence. His clothes were gone from our shared closet, his toiletries had disappeared from the bathroom, and his key was sitting on the kitchen counter next to a brief note that simply said, "Good luck with your backup plan." He'd moved out completely while I was at the wedding, taking only his personal belongings and leaving no forwarding address or contact information. In the space of one day, I'd lost not just my boyfriend, but my roommate, my financial partner, and my sense of security in the home we'd been sharing. Over the next few days, I tried calling and texting him, desperate to explain what I'd meant by my nice backup comment and to apologize for how it had come across. But he'd blocked my number, blocked me on all social media platforms, and effectively erased me from his life as completely as if our relationship had never existed. The social aftermath was almost as devastating as the personal loss. The photo of me stepping off the bus in my wedding attire began circulating in group chats among people who'd known me during my relationship with Cameron. Someone had captioned it, "When your backup plan backs out," turning my humiliation into a meme that would probably follow me for years. Friends who'd met David during our relationship were confused and curious about what had happened, but I was too embarrassed to explain the full story. How do you tell people that your relationship ended because you called your boyfriend a nice backup and he responded by orchestrating your public humiliation at your ex's wedding? The practical consequences were immediate and overwhelming. Without David's contribution to our shared expenses, I couldn't afford the apartment we'd been renting together. I had to find a smaller, cheaper place and deal with breaking leases, transferring utilities, and rebuilding my entire domestic life from scratch. But the emotional consequences were even worse than the logistical ones. I'd lost not just a relationship, but my faith in my own judgment about people and relationships. David had revealed himself to be capable of a level of calculated cruelty that I never could have anticipated from the kind, steady man I thought I knew. The reflection period that followed was brutal and ongoing. In quiet moments, I replayed that wine-drunk conversation and thought about all the different ways I could have expressed my feelings about our relationship without reducing David to a backup plan. I could have told him I was grateful for his stability after experiencing Cameron's chaos. I could have said I valued his consistency and reliability. I could have explained that he made me feel safe and cherished in ways I'd never experienced before. Instead, I'd chosen words that made him feel like second choice, like someone I'd settled for rather than chosen with intention and enthusiasm. I'd revealed that I still thought about Cameron as the gold standard against which other relationships were measured, and that David was the consolation prize I'd accepted when I couldn't have what I really wanted. But David's response had been so disproportionate and cruel that it was hard to feel entirely responsible for what happened. He hadn't just ended our relationship, he'd destroyed my dignity, humiliated me in front of people from my past, and created a permanent record of my lowest moment that would probably follow me for years. The punishment didn't fit the crime, but I couldn't deny that there wouldn't have been a crime to punish if I'd been more thoughtful about how I expressed my feelings about our relationship. 6 months later, I'm still rebuilding my life from the wreckage of that wine-drunk conversation. I have a new apartment, a better understanding of my own capacity for thoughtlessness, and a hard-won appreciation for the difference between honesty and cruelty. I learned that words have power and consequences that extend far beyond the moment they're spoken. I learned that some people are capable of planning elaborate revenge while maintaining a facade of normalcy and affection. And I learned that calling someone a backup plan isn't just hurtful, it's relationship suicide disguised as honesty. But mostly, I learned that I'd had something precious and irreplaceable, and I destroyed it through my own carelessness and inability to recognize what I had until it was gone. David wasn't my backup plan. He was my chance at the kind of stable, loving relationship I'd always claimed to want, but had never learned to properly value. I thought I was being honest when I called him my nice backup. Instead, I was revealing that I'd never fully committed to our relationship, that I was still comparing him to a man who'd never been able to give me what I needed for the long term. The man I'd dismissed as a backup turned out to be someone who knew exactly how to make me understand what I'd lost. And now, every time I think about that bus ride to Cameron's wedding, I'm reminded that sometimes the people we underestimate are the ones most capable of teaching us lessons we'll never forget.